evening, my name is Tony Jones, and you are tuned in to The Coalition, where we discuss all sides of local, regional, and national news, politics, and current events. With me in studio, as always, is the lovely and talented Christine. Chris, good evening.
Good evening, Tony.
The PO taxpayer is here. PO, good evening.
Hey now.
Don't forget to check out coalitionradio.us for all your coalition needs. PO, you have over with our pals, I want to say media partners, but I can't say media partners just about yet, but over with our pals, Go Local Prov, which, if you don't know, is a hyper-local news aggregate website. You have a huge, and by the way, for all the PO fans out there, PO groupies is the word I'm going to use. You divulge what could possibly be your real name, but then again, it might not be your real name. However, you have a huge piece over right now at golocalprov.com. Tell us about it.
Well, a few weeks ago, and let me preface it by saying Andrew Gobeel, a large presence in the Rhode Island media market, was nice enough to respond to my piece, and we've had a little bit of fun with it this afternoon. But I try to, in my own pretentious way, issue what I consider a manifesto for Rhode Island independent media. It's very easy from a number of sources for people to take shots at what we call here the new media. We're not traditional. We're not beholden to any real revenue source. We're not beholden to any large corporations. We certainly adapt a variety of methods of delivering our information. Here at the Coalition, we podcast, we write, and we work with, in and around a community of highly creative people who record, who use videography, anything what we feel appropriate to deliver the story, because for us it's all about the story. We do so way outside of the channels of normal media delivery, and in doing so have ruffled some feathers because, quite frankly, we're hitting them in the pocketbook. We're taking a lot of market share. Not us as an individual piece, but in the aggregate, when you look at the web and you look at all the different forms of new media, as a percentage of how people get their news now, it's exploded. And there's ups and downs to that. One of the things that we talk about in the piece is, sourcing. The media, the conventional media constantly takes new media to source because we don't double and triple source occasionally. Sometimes we take shortcuts. On the other hand, I like to point out that in major stories around the globe, the conventional media no sources. They choose to ignore the story completely.
Right, and other times those sources turn out to be fraud.
Politically motivated.
Or deliberately fraudulent in some cases. 60 Minutes had to retract a massive story about Benghazi because their super scoop turned out to have told 3 different stories to 3 different groups, and nobody knows what the truth is now.
Right.
So it's entirely possible he was telling the truth to 60 Minutes, or he was telling the truth to his bosses. Nobody knows.
Exactly.
And
And it's very fashionable amongst the elite right now, particularly given the events of the past few weeks with the John DePietro show and the controversy that's generated, to take talk radio and new media into one gigantic pot and just cast upon it all the woes of society. This is what I have to say. Talk radio is America, and by definition, is Rhode Island's town hall. It is the one source where regular folks like myself can routinely challenge, interrogate, get in the grill of the elite. And it's interesting because for all their disdain of the elite in this state, they all come to talk radio around election time because basically they need us. They just want to put their own spin on the story. So to them I say, we're not going away. We're better than ever. It's just that you're not sure where to look for us anymore because we're coming from a lot of different locations. And in the piece I mentioned people like R.I. Future, the folks down in South County Productions, who are doing tremendous videography. Across the board, there are people providing you information in the state. You just have to take the time sometimes to dig a little harder to find it, or to make the extra step of checking it out on your computer because it may not be delivered to you via Gene Valicenti in Channel 10. So, we had a lot of fun with it. We're going to continue to debate this because, like I said, we're not going away. We're here for the long run. The news this week was mixed at best, whether you're a progressive or a libertarian. We had a couple of interesting events, and it's sort of on a micro level, I think, reflect the silliness of how Rhode Island is run. This past week, Chris, you and I noted that there was a crackdown on a problem that was eviscerating the very moral core of Rhode Island.
What about the children?
That's right.
My God, hookah bars on Atwells Avenue, are esteemed, and I got to be careful because we do broadcast within the city confines of the city of La Prave. Our esteemed head maestro of safety here in the city, Mr. Parry, decided that shooting galleries out around the West End, no big deal. People getting run over in the middle of Atwells Avenue, any one of 1,000. Oh, listen, Andrew Ronaldo from the Board of Licensing. Listen, hey, child prostitution and slavery at Cheaters. Hey, 30 days, you're back in business. But dang it, if you smoke a hookah, which, by the way, is a legal product here in the United States, if you are seen smoking a hookah in a non-smoking section of a restaurant, we're out to get you. And boy, did they. I mean, what do you say?
Here's the real problem with this. People are smoking hookahs in hookah bars. They're not smoking them in restaurants. They're not smoking them in regular bars. They're not going to places where anybody expects anything to be happening other than hookah smoking.
Right.
It's exactly the same as going to a cigar bar.
Right, and because...
And they should be licensed like cigar bars if they aren't already. And to some extent, shame on the owners of these establishments for not checking into that. But why on earth is the police tracking down people who are doing something that it says they're doing on the marquee of the shop? That deters people who are not interested in sitting next to someone smoking a hookah from entering in the first place.
Hey, let's go down to Jill's cigar bar. There's cigars in here?
That's right. That's exactly
disgusting.
If you've ever walked past the door of a cigar bar, there's this reek of cigars, the stench that comes out the door. And if you're a non-smoker, you know that you don't want to go in. As someone who doesn't smoke myself, I have no interest in going to a hookah bar. And as far as I'm concerned, they can smoke to their heart's content in there.
These are legitimate establishments, fully licensed in terms of the licenses offered by the state and the city. They provide a legal product. They employ people. I mean, our next discussion is going to be about electrical rates. Given the incredible expense of running any sort of enterprise here within the dreaded private sector of Rhode Island, it is astonishing to me, with all the other issues being faced by the city of Providence, that in this moment of time, they would bust these people's chops. I don't smoke hookah. Grateful Dead experience regardless.
No, from what I gathered from the brief article I saw, it was the clientele is mostly Middle Eastern men who are used to this culturally, and hipsters. They didn't even mention the hipsters in the article, but right. I know some youngish hipster types who've gone to check out the hookah scene.
And again, this is the United States of America. So, thank God all the other problems in Providence have been solved.
That's right.
Just the priorities in this place amaze me.
Maybe they could take a page out of the East Providence Police's book and pull people over every 5 minutes for driving 1 mile an hour over the speed limit.
By the way, P.O., if you need a ride home, because chances are your car's not going to be here anymore after you said that, or we'll have to get the Denver boot off of there. But
right, on to electrical rates again. What is it? I think, what are they going to raise them now? 300 or 400 or 500%. You're going to have to pay them in script, generated by the city of Providence. They're talking about double-digit increases in electrical rates here in the state, as if this state isn't disadvantaged enough when it comes to, never mind attracting new business, it's just trying to keep the poor guys who are in business now in place. How do they justify this at the Public Utility Commission? And what was clearly, a sort of a last-minute, behind-the-scenes move, there was an attempt Friday morning to instigate new rules for enforcing shutdowns. Had a nice conversation with the people at the PUC who are very good at getting back to me, who claim that this was an ongoing issue, an ongoing discussion, that they just decided to bring up, that there was no attempt, but no last minute way to short circuit the rules. My shout out to the people at the Wiley Center for getting all over this issue and letting people know about it, so that there was a presence at a 9 o'clock in the morning meeting. Yeah, the average taxpayer has no issue going to a public meeting on Halitosis Hall at 9 o'clock in the morning. So,
exactly.
Well, everybody's unemployed, so they can all show up.
But again,
there probably are some actual heavy hitters who could go to that if they knew the meeting was happening.
Yeah, but what do you say to these people? Is there any, and what's the term in high school English? A willing suspension of disbelief?
Something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So, sleep tight, Rhode Islanders. There's no drama here. Nothing to see. Move along, please. Between the double-digit increases given to National Grid, as well as our impending wind turbines, which are going to, double in rates, no problems.
Oh, yeah, as it turns out, wind turbines as a technology are getting cheaper and cheaper, and they're roughly competitive with coal these days. So we locked in at a nice high rate.
Just in time.
Just in time.
Wow.
After this monologue, I'm so depressed that I'd like to go smoke a little hookah to relax. Oh, wait.
If only you could.
I can't.
Well, that was the news this week here at, the website progresses, coalitionradio.us. We're getting additional contributors to blog.
Some heavy hitters, too.
Yeah, we're having a lot of fun with this. Greg Garrett has started to submit us postings. If you didn't have a chance to listen to the show with Greg Garrett, it's up on our coalitionradio.us. You can listen to it linked there or on iTunes. We commend it to your attention. He's a wonderful guy. The net result of our meetings with him has been, again, we realize that we're a lot closer in opinions than we ever thought.
Strange bedfellows.
There you go. Right. But on to today's show. We are uniquely thrilled today to have with us really a legend in local legal circles.
Who, by the way, you might need to bail you out after you just dogged Mr. Perry.
New meeting too. I'm going to call my attorney. Mr. Mann? Let me tell you a little bit about Robert Mann, Esquire. Now, you've seen him on the news for years. He is possibly the most recognizable figure in news media today. Quite frankly, because most of those people have a shelf life of about 6 months. But any case that means anything on a criminal level over the 15 or 20 years that I've lived here in this state, somehow or another, Mr. Mann has been associated with it. He's a graduate of Yale University. He practices in just about every court imaginable, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, a number of appellate courts, federal courts. He has argued before the United States Supreme Court. If there's a controversial case where you've got that kind of gray zone where all of a sudden you've got the media hyping the presumed guilt, where there's a question of someone's ability to have a fair trial, you'll probably see Mr. Mann there. He's sort of the cavalry when it comes to civil rights and in the judiciary here in Rhode Island. Welcome, Mr. Mann. Good to have you on.
Good afternoon.
I usually lead off with the same question for just about everybody, because I ask them in a sense to give us an assessment or a report card. So I would ask you this kind of general question. In your mind, what is the state of justice here in the state of Rhode Island?
Well, there's good news and bad news. I don't think we're worse off than other states. I don't think we're worse off than the federal system. I think the system's better than it is in a lot of countries, and it's still horrible. We still lock up way too many people. A disproportionate number of the people we lock up are minorities. A disproportionate number of the people we lock up are poor. And in my opinion, it's a value judgment. An awful lot of the people we lock up don't need to be locked up at all. We have very high numbers of people on probation and parole, in addition to the people that we incarcerate, and all of that is an incredible drag on these people. It keeps them from going forward, and that's not to say that we don't need prisons. We do need prisons. We do need to protect society from some people, but my argument is that we don't need to lock up anywhere near the numbers and the percentages of people we do.
Where did we go wrong? What was it? Truth in sentencing laws? Was it mandatory minimums? What was was it the war on drugs? What led us to the point we're at today?
There's no single answer, I don't suppose. Some behavioral scientists would love to be able to do a cause and effect, but it's all of the above. I mean, one quote that I can't take credit for was one of the commentators said they didn't know whether we were winning or losing the war on drugs, but we surely were taking a lot of prisoners.
Wow.
You get to the point where almost uniformly until the last couple of years, politicians have learned to be tough on crime. Everybody remembers what happened to Mike Dukakis when he ran for president, and he got and Hortonized almost became a verb. Politicians became afraid, I think, to talk about decreasing penalties, afraid of the horror story if one person got out and committed a bad crime. And you saw that even with Democratic politicians who traditionally might have represented or been the voice for the poor. In the last couple of years, you've begun to see some people, both on the right and the left, realize that we've just gone way too far with incarceration, and we've got to do something better. We've got to do something different. Because whatever we're doing now clearly isn't working.
Right.
And it's incredibly expensive.
I like to talk that we've become what I call Nancy Grace Nation. If you've ever seen the execrable, is that on MSNBC or CNN this year, whatever?
I don't know, but it's painful.
Nancy Grace show, where the most horrific case involving some poor member of the white trash nation is excoriated for a horrific crime that they are presumed to have committed, has led us to a metification of the justice system to a point I don't know ever seen before in American history. Is the concept of presumed innocence, is it dead or is it irrelevant in this country?
It's not dead, it's not irrelevant, but I think that if you asked people what do they think when they see somebody who's starting a trial, I think most people would say to you, if you could engage in a long dialogue with them, initially they would say, I presume they're innocent. But if you kept talking to them, most of them would say, well, there's a reason somebody's here. They're here because the police charged them. The police wouldn't waste time charging them if they weren't here. So yes, I believe in presumption of innocence, and in some cases where we've been able to do extended voir dire, we'll get people to talk like that, and then they'll say, well, I believe in the presumption of innocence, so the person can explain why they're here and why they didn't do anything, which of course negates the whole presumption of innocence.
Right.
Well, I imagine you spent a considerable amount of time in jury selection.
We spend as much time as the courts will give us.
How difficult is it to get a fair trial in Rhode Island?
I don't think it's just Rhode Island. I think most of my experience is Rhode Island. I think, and it varies around the country, but the problem is not just Rhode Island. The problem is around the country. Everybody's on this anti-crime kick. You vilify everybody for every single crime. Look, some crimes are serious, but we prosecute people. We make everything seem super serious. I think it is hard for people to get a jury that doesn't start off with some presumptions against people who are charged with crimes.
The 24-hour news cycle, has it made it difficult to find potential jury members who aren't aware of every intimate detail, purported or otherwise, of the crime?
Well, I think what really has made it difficult is you can never be sure what jurors have looked up on the internet. And 25 years ago, 20 years ago even, it was hard to get information about a case if you were a member of a jury. Now, anybody can plug in names in the internet and start getting all the information they want. And how do you ever find out if they've done that? And I've never sat on a jury, but what a terrible temptation it must be to be sitting on a jury thinking, I could learn about this case if I just popped in the name of the defendant or pop in the name of the police officer. Or I'm curious about who this expert is. Let me read up about this expert. It must be terribly tempting, and we know it is tempting. Judges caution jurors not to do it. But we know it takes place.
Unless you're going to sequester everyone, which is an unreasonable burden.
I mean, but
you have to trust people to some extent, and that's an unnerving prospect if you're a defendant.
I mean, I can't imagine right now saying to somebody, we're going to separate you from your cell phone for 2 weeks.
Yeah, that will not happen.
It's laughable.
Yeah.
So do you argue, I mean, is there a point where at a predetermined level, if you will, of seriousness of the purported crime, do you insist on a sequester? When was the last time, I guess, given how active you are in the criminal courts, that you were involved with a sequestered jury?
I've never had a sequestered jury.
Really?
Because of the expense. I mean, the expense becomes almost impossible to bear. I think the hardship on people of sequestration is incredible. Not only are they separated from their contacts, but more and more you have jurors who aren't in traditional families, who have child-rearing responsibilities, work responsibilities. Being on a jury can be a real economic hardship for a juror. Mm-hmm. So and for the courts, it would add an enormous amount of expense to have sequestration. You would add an enormous amount of expense for the courts to even keep a jury beyond 4:30, because you're talking about the extra labor costs, the security costs, all those things. Mm-hmm. It is very unusual to see courts go past the normal working day right now.
So even some of the more notorious cases?
No sequestration.
Wow. Okay. We talk about sentencing guidelines. We also talk about good time laws. In the past year or two, given the Woodmansey case, amongst others, there's everybody in Rhode Island has become an expert, or so they think, on good time laws. Now, for folks who aren't familiar with that case, you had a notorious child murder take place. Mr. Woodmansey was found guilty and sentenced to an extended period of time in jail. He was able to carve off years of it by quote-unquote earning what they call good time laws. Time off for good behavior? Right. In a sense, by I guess, pursuing activities within prison by completing educational requirements. The outrage porn, we talk a lot in the show about outrage porn, where the media seizes on an issue and in an attempt to gin up ratings, in an attempt to obscure other issues, just runs with it night and day, to the point where it's part of everybody's water cooler conversation. Everybody's an expert. Everyone's got a feeling on it. The sad part of that case was it destroyed the concept of good time law in a lot of people's minds, because the ultimate association was that here you had this horrific child murder, and this guy's going to get time off, and then painted with one broad brush the entire concept. What's your thought on good time laws?
Good time laws are critical to the administration of the system, and they're absolutely essential. You want, and people get good time for a lot of reasons. They get it for not getting in trouble. They get it for participating in programs. They get it for doing work in the prison. There are a lot of different ways you get good time. You want to give everybody in prison every possible incentive to earn as much good time as possible. There are a handful of people who are never getting out of prison. People sentenced to life without parole, and then another handful for whom parole is very difficult. The people who are serving life sentences, multiple life sentences, consecutive life sentences. But the vast, vast majority of people that we send to prison are coming right back into our community at some point in the future. And you want to create a system where they have every incentive to behave, not just when they get out, but even while they're in the system. They're critical. I think they're critical to the administration of justice. And we ought to have more good time laws. We ought to have more opportunities for people to do things in the prison. We ought to make more opportunities for them. We ought to increase those programs, not decrease them. And frankly, one of the places where they're really sadly lacking, if you want to compare systems, Rhode Island has some good time laws. The federal system has very little in the way of good time, a maximum of a little less than 15%. There ought to be an increase in that.
It also has a marked impact on the day-to-day, I'll call it, life of people in the system, not just for prisoners, but also the people who work in the system on a day-to-day basis. I have a number of family members who point towards good time laws being a safety valve for literally keeping some level of control on what could fastly become a lawless society.
I agree with that. I think they're right.
Okay. Yeah, I can't imagine being a prison warden and wondering what's going to happen every day without having something in place where people have a reason. You need carrots and sticks.
It all stems back to another issue. There is also, missing also in action with the presumption of innocence is also the notion that everyone, regardless of their presumed guilt, is entitled to the highest quality legal assistance available. The reactionary element in society looks at someone who has been branded as a lawbreaker, and they automatically assume that this person should be damned to eternal damnation to the seventh circle of hell of the legal system, and should have no way out, no hope, and they're not deserving of a shekel of our efforts. Your experience in your practice is that you've told me that it's in excess of 90% of criminal law. What is the state? I mean, to get someone like yourself, if you're indigent as a criminal, would be a godsend. Overall, legal services in the state of Rhode Island, how effective are they, and is there budget issues? What's your sense of the state of legal services for the indigent or assumed guilty prisoner?
Well, let's take the indigent, and let's talk about it in the context of criminal law, because that's what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Rhode Island has an incredibly good public defender's office. They're phenomenal. Most of the people who work in that office are unbelievably skilled and unbelievably dedicated, and we ought to recognize that, okay? And then we ought to recognize the fact they don't have all the resources they need, okay? And that's what's so unfair about the system, okay? A lot of indigent people get court-appointed counsel because the public defender's office has a conflict. The overwhelming majority of those people are dedicated. They work very hard. They're not that concerned about how much they're getting paid. But the question becomes what resources are available. And money matters to some extent in terms of getting experts, in terms of having multiple lawyers involved in a case. You read about high-profile people with lots of money. You almost never read that they only have one lawyer involved. They almost always have a team of lawyers because two heads are better than one. I don't care who you are. Oftentimes in these high-profile cases, the prosecutors will have a team of prosecutors. You need to give defendants equal resources. And when there are budget concerns, there's going to be pressure on court-appointed lawyers and on the public defender's office in terms of how much can they spend on experts, how much can they spend on transcripts, how much time how big is the caseload for the public defender. And my response to all of that is this. If society wants to lock up as many people as they're locking up right now, then they have an absolute obligation to provide more funding, adequate funding, so that everybody gets top-flight representation. They're getting top-flight people, but those people need to have smaller caseloads and access to more funds.
What does it cost, as someone who hasn't been incarcerated yet, for a non-violent drug offender who may not qualify for legal assistance?
Sitting right here.
What does it cost to go through? I mean, I don't know if it's an unfair question because there's so many intangibles, but what does it cost to get your name cleared? If in fact you're not guilty, or to heck with it, if you are guilty, what does it cost to work your way through that system?
To hire a lawyer to do that?
Yeah.
Oh, the rates vary enormously. Okay, but you can sometimes you might get away with $3,000 or $4,000, and you might spend $20,000 or $30,000, and sometimes it depends on how much time people put into it. Sometimes it depends on what they know about the system themselves. Sometimes it depends on the facts of the case. But there are cases where it just takes a lot of money to work up a case. More and more, one of the things we're seeing in cases is the use of science in some fashion or another. But science needs experts. Experts need to get paid, usually at the rate of $250 or so an hour, give or take a little bit. Maybe some $150, maybe some $400 an hour. When you start talking about paying an expert $250 an hour, 10 hours of prep time, 10 hours to testify, that's $5,000 just for one expert. The infusion of science is great. We need more science in the system, but that's adding a significant layer of expense.
So what happens to the individual who just can't pull it together, that kind of money?
A lot of those people deservedly qualify for the public defender. And the truth is that to the absolute credit, and I see this from the outside, I don't know exactly how the public defender determines who's eligible, but it appears they recognize the fact that somebody who might be able to afford a lawyer for a misdemeanor charge of marijuana might not be able to afford a lawyer for a murder case because the expenses are so different for the different types of cases. But I think it's a struggle. I think there's a real struggle in terms of how do you get the resources, how do you spend the time, and also for individuals. Middle-class families, do you put $40,000 or $50,000 into one child's case when you've got 3 children and the other 2 are looking at college? Where do you allocate your resources? Tough questions for families.
Wow. What we're going to talk about in our next segment is the probationary environment and just how that contributes to that same cost environment, because it would appear that most of the states either in prison or on probation.
And before we go there, let me go back to one thing you mentioned just briefly. You talked a moment ago about good time, and then in that question you talked about sentencing guidelines and all that. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we also have to think about is whether you call them sentencing benchmarks, which is what they are in state court, sentencing guidelines, which is what they are in federal court. The real question is, what are we doing with mandatory minimum sentences? Where we say to a judge, you don't have the discretion to impose an appropriate sentence. You must sentence somebody to a certain minimum amount of incarceration. Those are really horrible laws. They're generated in the legislature, usually after some public outcry, and they take away the discretion from the courts to make an individualized assessment. I can give you examples in very serious cases or in very small cases. Take drunk driving cases, for example. We have a rule that says first-time drunk driving, by and large, it's a mandatory minimum loss of license for 90 days. That means for a lot of Rhode Islanders, they're going to be unemployed because an awful lot of Rhode Islanders simply can't get to work if they can't drive. A judge doesn't even have the discretion to give them a right to drive to and from work. A judge doesn't even have the discretion to say to somebody who's convicted of drunk driving, I'll let you drive your relative to the hospital for their weekly treatment. Wow. That's a horrible law. We have lots of laws like that impose minimum jail sentences on things. We have laws that impose minimum jail sentences for certain drug offenses in both the state and federal system. Those laws are bad laws. They put all the authority in the hands of the prosecutor. If you're charged with that offense and the offense isn't amended, the judge has no discretion whatsoever. We ought to, by and large, get rid of all these mandatory minimums. We go through a very strong vetting process before somebody becomes a judge. I certainly don't agree with judges about everything, but you ought to at least give them the discretion to not give somebody a mandatory minimum sentence, and that's one of the things that drives up prison populations. It puts all the power in the hands of the police and the prosecution. That's wrong.
In this political climate, do you see any hope of that happening?
I do see hope, actually. You want desperately to believe the glass is half full, not half empty. On a national level, you see some people beginning to recognize that the cost of incarceration is so high they've got to begin to look at alternatives. You did see the mandatory minimum sentences for crack cocaine get amended. Not so it's equal to cocaine, but at least the discrepancy between the treatment of cocaine and crack was reduced significantly. I think that people are beginning to realize that we can't afford the luxury of responding to every single outcry about a particular crime or one particular event and increasing mandatory minimums. I think that this country, because we're in such bad economic shape, may come around to appreciating that we have to really examine the cost of this criminal justice system and save it for the relatively small handful of cases that really require the invocation of that system. An awful lot of stuff doesn't require the criminal justice system.
To people like myself who aren't part of the system, the notion of 3 strikes seemed like an arbitrary, almost capricious reaction to a political concern. Your reflection on that?
I agree totally, and that's you just given me another example. We have all kinds of cases that say the second offense, the penalty ought to be enhanced. Well, generally that's probably true, but how much ought it to be enhanced? Why can't you say to a judge, I'm going to calibrate this depending on what's taking place. I'm going to give you a chance to at least go to work, to at least go to the doctor. I'm going to give you a chance to not go to jail when there's a mandatory jail sentence imposed. So yes, I think that we ought to get rid of almost all these mandatory minimums, almost all these automatic enhancements.
You are tuned into the Coalition. We are about halfway through the program, which means we need to take a quick break. Don't forget to check out coalitionradio.us on Facebook, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, and on Twitter @coalition_radio. We have some questions coming through on Twitter, so we'll get to those after the break with our in-studio guest, attorney Robert Mann.
Definitive source for cannabis culture, with a print magazine, radio show, live events, and so much more. Check them out online at 13folds.com. That's the number 13, FOLDS.com.
My name is Angel Rach. I'm a mother of 2 teenage children, and I fought all the way to the Supreme Court for the right to use the medicine that saved my life. I've been permanently disabled for 10 years, with an inoperable brain tumor, wasting syndrome, and several other serious conditions. For 4 years, I was in a wheelchair, in so much pain, I couldn't even hug my kids. The hardest part was looking in their eyes and seeing how much they were suffering because of my medical condition. The medicine that gave me my life back and gave my kids their mom back was cannabis, also known as medical marijuana. With medical marijuana, I can walk, maintain my weight, and I can be a mom. Without it, my doctors believe that I would die. To learn more about medical marijuana, contact Marijuana Policy Project at 1-877-JOIN-MPP or on the web at mpp.org.
Hey everybody, it's Tony Jones. You know, when I'm not here yakking about politics, I spin records. That's right, if you like good old-fashioned rock and roll radio the way God intended it to be, then tune in to The Tony Jones Show. The information's online at tonyjones.org. That's tonyjones.org.
I found a picture of you.
Heading out on the town tonight? Be sure to log on to providencenightout.com and don't forget to check their cell phone app. That's providencenightout.com. Heading out on the town tonight? Be sure to log on to providencenightout.com and don't forget to check their cell phone app. That's providencenightout.com.
Tony Jones here. You are tuned in to the Coalition online at coalitionradio.us, on Facebook, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, and on Twitter at Coalition _radio. PO Taxpayer is here. Christine is here. Good evening.
Good evening.
Our in-studio guest is attorney Robert Mann. And Mr. Mann, coming through on Twitter through the magic of this new media from @OurTroubledTimes, he wants to know your view on private prisons and the problem, in his opinion, the big problem of private prisons specifically in the southern states.
We have a private prison here, the Wyatt facility, right in Central Falls.
Yes.
Look, there are some people who work in private prisons who are good, just as there are in regular prisons, some who are bad. But generally speaking, I don't like the concept of private prisons. The reason I don't like the concept of private prisons is, at the end of the day, private prisons have to make a profit. And I think that's a very dangerous sort of bottom line for an institution that's charged with the custodial care of people.
I had a job interview at the Wyatt Detention Center, and I don't scare very easily, and I was there as a potential employee, and I was kind of scared out of my wits just being there.
I mean, I want to say something. Some of the people at Wyatt are terrific people. They're terrific professionals. But they work for a corporation, and that corporation has to try and make money.
Right.
And I think if the government wants to lock up people, then the government ought to bear direct responsibility for the care of those people, and I don't think they ought to be able to farm out the care of those people and, in effect, abdicate some of their responsibility even indirectly.
Right.
That's why.
Yeah, well, there's the issue of them possibly not spending enough money to adequately care for people, and on top of that, there's the issue of them always needing more inmates in order to keep the money flowing.
There are two parts to that. Yeah, the care is really critical. And one of the places it becomes critical is the cost of medical care for inmates. Mm-hmm. And that becomes even more critical as you have an older and older prison population. So all of that matters. I think the comment you make about how private prisons need to have more and more inmates, let's not kid. I agree with that 100%, but let's not kid ourselves. Other participants in the criminal justice system also need lots of inmates to keep themselves going. And if the number of people in the Rhode Island prison system went down by 50%, say, which would still make it a lot higher than it was per capita, say, 20 years ago, there'd presumably be less correctional supervisors, less correctional officers, all of the above.
Good point. So there'd be layoffs there as well.
There'd be layoffs, and you can't discount the economic consequences of that. But you can't keep locking people up to provide jobs.
Right.
That's the wrong way to do economic development.
But that's the danger of becoming too reliant on some of this and building this up into this enormous enterprise.
And corrections is a big business right now.
Right.
And a lot of people would be out of work if we decrease the prison population. Mm-hmm. Even to a level that was still way above what the level was 30 or 40 years ago.
Right, so we might actually be seeing some sub-rosa pushback on the idea of decriminalizing certain drugs.
Well, I don't think it's even sub-rosa. I think the unions, when you have a big dispute in the state, you'll hear the unions speaking up about, I think they spoke up, I'm not sure about the Woodmansey thing, you'll see them speaking up about other sorts of programs that threaten, that indicate you might have more people released. And we've got to guard against that now. That's not to say you shouldn't talk about what you do with people in corrections when they get out of corrections. In fact, one of the things we ought to start thinking about as society is what we do with correctional officers is really, really tough. We put them in a prison and say work there for 30 years. If you go into the service and you have one of these high-tension jobs, they won't let you be in a nuclear submarine for 30 years in a row. You're on the submarine for maybe 4 years, and then you got duty someplace else, doing something else. We don't do that with correctional officers.
I can imagine the burnout rate must be pretty significant, and these people are still there and burned out.
And they need I would say they need a break. So I think it's one of the toughest jobs you can have. So I'm sympathetic to that extent. But that doesn't
excuse what might happen.
Exactly.
Well, one of the biggest feeders, if you will, of our population in the correctional system is, in fact, the correctional system through the form of how we manage probation here in the state of Rhode Island. What's your thoughts on how we work people through probation, and are there too many people on probation, and is it too easy to fall into the probationary, recidivism vortex, if you will?
This is a report from the Department of Corrections, the Rhode Island Department of Corrections, in November of 2011. As of December 2009, Rhode Island ranked fourth in the nation in the rate of probation supervision, 3,129 per 100,000 residents. We have one of the high. Our rate 74 at that point in 2009 was 74% higher than the national average. We have way too many people on probation. It's a terrible. drag on everybody. There's no need to have that many people on probation. There's no excuse in the world for us being that high compared to the rest of the country. We should dramatically reduce the number of people on probation.
What brought us to this point? I mean, was it just a self-interest in the form of the bureaucracy looking to maintain a population?
I don't really have a good historical explanation. I mean, our rate of incarceration per capita compared to other states is a little bit lower. Historically, the Northeast has had a lower rate of incarceration than some other parts of the country. But our probation rate is very high. I'm not sure what the historical reason is. I know we could cure it, we could reduce it. A lot of these people are in inactive probation, but it's still an incredible handicap to somebody to have to report that they're on probation when they're applying for a job.
How often, and this is purely anecdotal obviously, but as a practicing criminal lawyer, how often do you find that simple violations of probation result in repeat, time in prison?
It happens a lot, and not only does it sometimes happen that you can't go, you get sent back to prison, or you end up with more supervision, you end up with more problems, you end up going to court. It's just emotionally walking around with a sort of an emotional ball and chain around your neck. Mm-hmm. And most of the people who are on probation are not supervised that much, but you still have this emotional sort of drag on you. And we need to get people in and out of the system and give them a chance to start again. I mean, what we're really talking about is we need to reduce the whole number of people in the system right now. And, one thing that's got to be said, too, is just you can't do a show like this without talking about the fact that the people in the system are disproportionately minority and disproportionately poor.
Right.
I mean, and you can argue about how much the disproportion is, but it's enormous. And we can't possibly provide adequate services to all the people in the system, both on probation and in the prison system. Reduce the size of the population dramatically, decriminalize a lot of stuff, and then for the people in the system, provide them with real services, including real mental health services. You can quarrel with what percentage of the people in the prison system need mental health services, but it's a very high percentage, and we're not providing them with adequate mental health services.
When you talk about the prison population, the failed war on drugs in Rhode Island, to what degree does that contribute to that process?
I think it's huge. I mean, anecdotally, a lot of people think that it's easily 2/3 of the people in the system are related to drug problems. That's not to say they're in there for drug problems, but for drug offenses. But if you talk about why they're in the system, a lot of people, you might use a number like that. They might go a little higher, they might go a little lower, but the point is that it's a huge, huge problem. I mean, and we ought to start with the simplest thing. We ought to just decriminalize marijuana. We ought to decriminalize it nationally. We ought to decriminalize it on the state level and get rid of all the hypocrisy that takes place in the state, okay? Then we ought to start talking about decriminalizing the possession of all other drugs. Instead of making felons out of everybody who uses a little coke, it's sort of random enforcement anyway, okay? That's another thing we ought to think about doing. We ought to start thinking about the drug problem as a health problem, not as a penal problem.
Right.
And we ought to start spending money on educating kids. I don't think it's healthy for 13-year-old kids to be using drugs, whether they're legal or illegal, but we ought to start educating them about why it's unhealthy, and maybe we can get someplace. Those are just opening lines on how we ought to begin to reform what we do.
Well, and the frustration there is that the general media, the minute the suggestion is made to do that, those people, the messengers, are shot because they are, quote unquote, soft on crime.
And what I want to believe and hope is a couple of things. One is that it's getting to be very expensive to be hard on crime. And I think economics may ultimately trump people's concern about being soft on crime. That's my hope. Another thing, I think we do see a change in this country's attitude toward marijuana right now in all kinds of different ways. And maybe that's the opening sort of salvo in having a new perception of how we deal with the drug problem in this country. It's going to take time, and in the meantime, a lot of people are going to be convicted of crimes. Some are going to be sent to jail. Even if they're not sent to jail, they're going to end up with criminal records, labeled a drug offender, and then when they apply for a job, all kinds of jobs, it's going to be so much harder for them to get a job. One of the things Rhode Islanders ought to think about, every time we create a criminal record for somebody who lives in Rhode Island, we make it that much more difficult for that person to get any kind of a job, and that's an incredible economic problem for the state. And if that person happens to be a part of the family and trying to support 2 or 3 other people, you've now created a real problem, not just for that person, but for their whole family. You talk about the number of people on probation and in prison, you're talking about really impacting a really high percentage of the people around, and if you go to minority communities, an incredibly high percentage.
Right, and as you pointed out, it disproportionately affects people from lower income families.
Absolutely. There's just
even at the enforcement level, if you're a well-to-do college kid with a little bit of coke in your pocket, odds are you're going to get some sort of a slap on the wrist compared to someone else.
The odds are you're not going to get caught.
Yeah, well, A, you're not going to get
What's
caught.
the chance you get caught?
A, you're not going to get caught because when you're walking down the street, the police don't suspect you. They don't think anything of you. B, if you do get caught, there's a decent chance one of your parents is going to be worried about, oh no, she's going to ruin her whole future, and hire a very good lawyer for you.
And
because they can.
I mean, you raise another issue. We ought to increase dramatically our use of diversion programs that result in disposition of cases without criminal records. It ought not to be used occasionally. It ought to be the rule of thumb for all nonviolent first offenders. That's another thing we ought to do. I mean, and we can go on and on about other things that we ought to be doing. I mean, let me mention one other pet peeve I have that will not be popular with a lot of people. Sex offender registration has become a big, big subject, okay? Mm-hmm.